At my son's will reading, my daughter-in-law stood up. She looked around the room and announced in a steady voice that my wife was mentally unstable, that she wasn't clear-minded enough to inherit anything. Then, she placed a stack of medical records on the table, like she was hammering the final nail into our dignity. The room went silent. No one moved. No one breathed too loudly. And I didn't react. I simply glanced down at my watch. Calm, patient, because the only person in that room who truly didn't understand what was happening was her. If you're listening to this story, and you know what it feels like to be doubted by your own family, go ahead and subscribe. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I read every one of them. And sometimes, just knowing you're not alone is enough to keep going. Back in that heavy, suffocating room, I stayed quiet, and I let Catherine finish her part. Catherine didn't sit down after placing the file in front of the attorney. She stayed standing, both hands pressed against the long wooden table in the living room of the Hamptons estate, as if the room belonged to her. Rain tapped softly against the tall glass windows. Steady, cold. I kept looking at my watch. Attorney Vance hadn't spoken yet. He simply turned the pages, one at a time. Catherine took the floor on her own. Her voice was clear, calm in a way that felt almost rehearsed. She said Diane had been wandering away from home, that she didn't recognize relatives, that a doctor had recommended legal guardianship. Then she turned toward her side of the family, her mother and her brother, sitting straight-backed, like they'd practiced this before. They nodded, slowly. I felt Diane's hand in mine, still trembling, still soft. She didn't lift her head. Her shoulders pulled inward, like someone shrinking from a light that was too bright. If you didn't know her, you'd think she was confused or afraid. Catherine continued. She said that under the law, a person lacking cognitive capacity cannot inherit property. She said she only wanted to protect David's legacy from unnecessary loss. It sounded noble. I said nothing. There are moments in life when reacting too quickly only makes things worse. I learned that in 40 years of architecture, and in negotiations where people assumed I wasn't paying attention. When someone wants your reaction, the most powerful thing you can give them is silence. Years ago, I read about a method in a psychology book, the gray rock. No emotion, no reaction, no energy. Catherine needed that energy. She needed my outrage. She needed me to lose control, so her story would feel justified. But I only brushed Diane's hand gently with my thumb. Attorney Vance looked up. When were these records created, he asked. 3 months ago, Catherine answered immediately, after Mom started showing unusual behavior. 3 months ago. I remember that time very clearly. That was when Catherine began visiting more often than usual, bringing food, asking about Diane's health, offering to take her to see a doctor for just a routine check. I agreed. I wanted to see how far she would go. Catherine began listing small incidents. That Diane once called a cousin by the wrong name, that she forgot to lock the door, that she repeated a question twice. Little things. Things any 65-year-old woman might do on a tired day. But placed together, in a room full of people, under the yellow light of a rainy afternoon, they sounded like an indictment. I looked around the room. Catherine's relatives filled the row on the left. They weren't my family. They weren't Diane's. Yet today, they were present in full. The official reason was to share in the family's grief. The real reason, everyone understood. The estate, this mansion, the investments, everything they believed we were holding. Catherine ended her statement with a line that sounded reasonable. I don't want to make this bigger than it is, but we have to face the truth. The truth. I almost smiled. If she knew what the truth actually looked like, she wouldn't have been in such a hurry. I heard a quiet sigh behind me. Whispers began to ripple. The eyes in the room slowly turned toward me. A father who had just buried his son. A husband being told his wife was no longer of sound mind. I remained silent. I leaned closer to Diane and said softly, just for her to hear, "Let them talk." She gave the smallest nod. If anyone had watched carefully, they would have noticed her trembling had rhythm, not chaos, not loss of control. Intention. Catherine believed she controlled the room. She added that during David's final weeks, Diane had failed to understand the financial situation and had made concerning decisions. She looked directly at the attorney when she said it. Attorney Vance remained neutral. He placed the file on the table. "I will review these documents," he said. That was all. Catherine hesitated for just a second. Maybe she expected something stronger, an immediate declaration. But the law doesn't operate on emotion, and those familiar with the law don't either. I lifted the glass of water in front of me and took a small sip. My hand did not shake. Some may have thought I was frozen in shock. The truth was the opposite. I was waiting. I had been waiting for 6 months since David passed. Waiting to see who would reveal themselves. Waiting to see who would rush. Waiting to see who would look at two elderly people living in a modest wooden house in the suburbs, driving a 20-year-old car, and think we were easy prey. Catherine didn't realize that the moment she stood up today, she confirmed every suspicion I ever had. When she finished speaking, I glanced at my watch once more. We had exactly 10 minutes before the next part began. Have you ever sat in a room, listening to someone rewrite the story of your life, and known they were walking in the wrong direction entirely? If you have, then you understand why I wasn't angry. I was simply counting the time. 10 minutes. When you've lived nearly 70 years, 10 minutes isn't long. But in a room filled with eyes, quietly measuring what they think is theirs, 10 minutes can stretch into an entire chapter of your life. Catherine finally sat down. She leaned back in her chair, arms folded, her gaze drifting across the dark wooden walls, the old oil paintings, the crystal chandelier hanging in the center of the room. She looked at the mansion like it already belonged to her. I know that look. 6 months ago, after David passed, the way she saw us began to change. Before that, she kept at least a layer of courtesy. Afterward, the patience disappeared. Her questions became sharper, more direct. "How long are you two planning to keep that little house, the little wooden house in the suburbs?" "Diane and I have lived there for 20 years. Low roof, aging front porch, a backyard just big enough for a few flower beds. We drive a sedan that's nearly 2 decades old. The paint has faded, the leather seats are cracked." Catherine used to glance at it like it was something ready for the scrapyard. She assumed we had burned through our retirement, that I had failed at managing money, that now we were clinging to whatever was left of David like a life raft. She said it once, not directly, but clearly enough. "In this day and age, if you don't invest wisely, you have to live with the consequences." I simply nodded. I've never felt the need to prove anything to anyone, especially not to my daughter-in-law. What Catherine never knew was that 4 years ago I transferred all of my architectural design patents into an international trust. Those designs had been used in major commercial developments I never mentioned at family dinners. The last report I reviewed valued the trust at $22 million. We are not poor. We simply chose a quiet life. After David passed, I considered telling the truth. But I decided against it. I wanted to observe, to better understand the woman my son had trusted. Catherine brought up the life insurance money just days after the memorial. She said it needed to be handled quickly to avoid legal complications. I didn't object. I only asked that everything remain transparent. She agreed, too quickly. I began noticing small things. Phone calls she stepped outside to take. Messages she deleted the moment I entered the room. Once I happened to see a transfer notification on her phone screen before she turned it face down on the table. $1,200,000. A few weeks later, Catherine started mentioning Diane's forgetfulness. She offered to temporarily help manage finances. She said I was getting older, that I shouldn't carry so much responsibility alone. I nodded again. I opened a new account, not the main one, just a secondary account. I transferred an amount large enough to attract attention, but not large enough to cause harm if it disappeared. I didn't explain every detail to Diane. She only knew we were testing the heart. She looked at me for a long time that day, then agreed. I'm not proud of that decision. No father wants to test his daughter-in-law that way. But when you feel the air shift inside your own family, you learn to trust your instincts. Within a month, the money began moving through 3 separate accounts, all indirectly connected to a financial consulting firm registered under Catherine's brother's name. I didn't rush to accuse anyone. I hired an independent legal specialist to review the transactions. I never mentioned Catherine's name. I asked only for a neutral report. The report confirmed what I suspected. The money hadn't vanished. It had been rotated. I closed the bait account shortly after. Quietly. No confrontation. I wanted to see her next move. And her next move is the stack of fabricated medical records now sitting in front of Attorney Vance. Catherine needed a larger story to cover smaller traces. A story serious enough to stop people from asking about financial transfers and start focusing on Diane's mental condition. I glanced at my wife. Her head was still lowered, her shoulders trembling slightly. But I know Diane. I've lived beside her for 45 years. When she truly breaks, she goes completely silent. Right now, she was acting. Not for revenge, but to give the truth room to reveal itself. Catherine believed our wallet was empty. She believed 2 elderly people living simply must have nothing left to lose. She thought we were clinging to our son's estate because we had no other choice. She never understood we chose this life. I chose the small house because I don't need extra rooms. I chose the old car because I don't need other people's admiration. I chose silence because it makes impatient people talk too much. In the wide living room of the Hamptons mansion, the rain continued its steady rhythm outside. Catherine was growing restless. She asked Attorney Vance how much longer it would take before Diane was formally declared unfit to inherit. He did not answer directly. He only said that all documents must be thoroughly verified. I looked at my watch once more. 5 minutes. Catherine didn't realize she had already stepped too far by bringing this story into the open. She believed she was closing the door on Diane's future. In truth, she was opening another one. A door that once crossed offers no return. I gently tightened my grip on Diane's hand. "It's time," I whispered. And for the first time that entire afternoon, she lifted her head. Diane lifted her head slowly. Her eyes were no longer clouded like they had been minutes earlier. They were calm, focused, and even that brief shift made Catherine hesitate. But she recovered quickly. "If there are no further objections," Catherine said, "I believe we should proceed with reading David's final amended will." Amended Attorney Vance's brow tightened slightly. Catherine smiled. This time, she didn't bother hiding her confidence. She opened the handbag beside her chair and removed a carefully sealed, cream-colored envelope. "David signed this update 2 weeks before everything happened," she said. "He wanted to make sure the assets were handled properly." I didn't look at the envelope. I looked at her hand as she placed it on the table. It wasn't shaking. Too steady. Attorney Vance opened it and pulled out several pages. He skimmed the first sheet, then paused at the signature line. The room was completely silent. Only the steady rain against the tall windows filled the space. Catherine turned toward me. "Dad, don't you have anything to say?" I gave a small shake of my head. Silence forces the impatient to fill the space with their own words. Vance continued reading. The amendment was clean, direct. The Hamptons' property, along with full control of David's remaining investments, would be transferred entirely to Catherine. Diane, due to her declining cognitive condition, would have no role in any financial decisions. Neat structure, clear language. On the surface, legitimate. Only one detail mattered to me. The date, 2 weeks before David left the hospital. I remember that period clearly. I was by my son's side nearly every day. Diane sat beside his bed, holding his hand, speaking to him even when he couldn't respond. Catherine was there too, though she stepped out for phone calls more often than necessary. Attorney Vance set the pages down. "This signature," he began slowly. Catherine cut in immediately. It was signed in front of me. David was completely aware. I opened the tablet resting inside my leather case. Unhurried, without looking at anyone, I tapped the screen and opened a folder I had prepared weeks ago. Not out of anger, out of anticipation. "Mr. Vance," I said calmly, "before you confirm the validity of that document, I believe you should review additional data." Catherine turned sharply. "What are you implying?" I rotated the tablet toward the attorney. On the screen was a digital signature analysis performed by an independent expert. Not emotion, not suspicion. Data. The signature on the amended will showed unusually consistent pressure. No natural variation along the curved strokes. No tremor or drag you'd expect from someone fatigued. It resembled a stylus-generated mark. Attorney Vance read each line carefully. Catherine let out a short laugh. "Technical analysis. Anyone can generate a report like that." I didn't respond. I tapped the screen again. This time, a video. Not something I recorded myself. Footage extracted from the hospital's security system. The kind installed in private rooms for patient safety. There was no sound. It wasn't necessary. The The video showed Catherine sitting beside David's bed. My son lay still, eyes closed. She held his hand. In her other hand, a pen. She adjusted his fingers, guided them. Gentle, intentional. Attorney Vance stopped the video midway. The silence in the room had changed. It was no longer heavy. It was sharp. Catherine shot to her feet. I was helping him sign paperwork. That's completely normal. For the first time since the reading began, I looked directly at her. I agree, I said evenly. Helping is normal. Signing for him is not. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Attorney Vance rested his hand on the amended will. This document will require independent forensic examination. For now, I cannot recognize it as valid. Catherine's breathing began to lose rhythm. She looked around the room, searching for support from her family. No one spoke. I wasn't finished. There's one more matter, I said steadily. The $1,200,000 Catherine claimed Diane had misplaced. I opened another file. That money was never lost. It was transferred into a secondary account I established, an account that recorded every transaction. I never used the word bait. I didn't have to. The 3 subsequent transfers I continued led to a consulting firm directly connected to Catherine's family. Her brother's face drained of color. Catherine shook her head repeatedly. You're trying to distract everyone. No, I said. I'm clarifying. Attorney Vance looked at me, then at Catherine. He didn't say anything further, but I saw the shift in his eyes. The amended will was now simply a document under investigation, and Catherine no longer controlled the room. I set the tablet down. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only something I had been waiting months to feel. The truth, standing on its own. But it wasn't over, because Catherine still believed she had one final card left to play, and I knew she was about to use it. Catherine didn't sit down. She stood in the middle of that vast living room, both hands gripping the back of a chair. Not because she was weak, but because control was slipping through her fingers. All of this, she said, her voice no longer smooth, is interpretation. Nothing proves I did anything wrong. I didn't argue. That's true, I said. Right now, they're questions. I rose to my feet. I wasn't taller than anyone in that room. I wasn't younger. But there are moments in life when you don't need to raise your voice to be heard. Catherine, I said slowly, there's one thing you never asked. She looked at me, anger and unease tangled together in her eyes. You never asked how much of this house David actually owned. She frowned. This is his house. I gave a small shake of my head. Not entirely. Attorney Vance's attention sharpened. He knew I don't speak without paper behind my words. 3 years ago, I continued, David took out a substantial loan to keep your family's company from collapsing. Catherine's mother inhaled softly. Her brother straightened in his seat. That loan was secured against this very estate. Catherine shook her head. That's impossible. I don't know anything about that. I know, I said gently. I walked to the side table near the window where another folder had been resting. I didn't rush. I didn't look at anyone as I opened it. Your family's company received a strategic investment from a financial group, I said. The terms included asset enforcement rights if revenue targets were not met. Catherine's expression shifted. She understood where this was going. And that company, she said quietly, was not David's. I finished for her. It was mine. The silence that followed was different. Not dramatic. Not tense. Just awareness settling in. I am not an old man, living off my son's success. I am the chairman of the board of the firm that has held the lien on this house for the past 3 years. I never made my role public, I added. I didn't want David to feel controlled. I wanted my son to run his life freely. Catherine took a step back. He never told me. There are things I said a man doesn't share when he's trying to shield someone from pressure. I removed one final document. 10 minutes ago, I said I authorized activation of the enforcement clause. Your family's company has failed to meet its financial obligations for 6 consecutive quarters. I glanced at my watch. 10 minutes had passed since I told Diane it was time. What does that mean? Catherine's mother asked quietly. It means I said evenly as of this moment the legal ownership of this estate no longer rests with David or with Catherine. I didn't need harsher words. The truth carried enough weight. You can't do that, Catherine said. I live here. Temporarily, I replied. Under an internal lease agreement signed 3 years ago. She turned to Attorney Vance, searching for contradiction. He said nothing. He simply reviewed the documents I had provided, page by page. "You planned this," Catherine whispered. I looked at her. "I didn't plan to destroy you," I said quietly. "I planned to protect what remained." There was no pleasure in my voice, no triumph, only the steady result of choices leading here. Catherine believed that if she removed Diane from the board by labeling her unfit, she could control everything else. She never realized the legal framework around this house was constructed more carefully than any architectural design I've ever drawn. The room felt smaller now, not because its size had changed, but because the distance between ambition and reality had collapsed. "So what happens now?" her brother asked. "Now," I said, "my firm will proceed according to contract. Your family has a legal window to restructure its finances, or surrender the property." I didn't use the word eviction. I didn't need to. Catherine looked around the room she once believed was already hers. The walls, the paintings, the curved staircase leading upstairs. Everything was still in place. Only her certainty was gone. "All of this over a will?" she asked. I shook my head. "No," I said, "because greed made you believe two elderly people living simply didn't understand the law." I returned to my seat. "The reading of the will isn't finished," I said to Attorney Vance. And I knew, after everything that had just come into the light, the final part was only beginning. Attorney Vance gave a slight nod when I said the reading wasn't over. He adjusted his glasses and opened the official file that had remained untouched in front of him. The room was no longer noisy. No more arguments. Every eye turned toward him. "The last valid will David executed," he said slowly, "was drafted 8 months ago. Not 2 weeks. 8 months. I felt Diane gently squeeze my hand. Not out of fear, but because she no longer needed to perform. The attorney began to read. David did not leave everything to Catherine. He did not remove Diane from any rights. Instead, the majority of his liquid assets were placed into an educational foundation in his name, intended to support architecture students facing financial hardship. I already knew. David and I had discussed it one quiet evening when he was still clear enough to think long-term. He told me that if life ended sooner than expected, he wanted to leave something useful behind. I didn't interrupt. "The Hamptons property," Attorney Vance continued, "shall be handled in accordance with existing financial agreements," which meant my decision as corporate representative stood on solid ground. No loopholes. When he finished reading, the silence in the room shifted again. Not the silence of suspense, but of conclusion. Then came a knock at the door. Not urgent, not aggressive, just punctual. 2 law enforcement officers entered alongside a federal financial compliance representative. No one was restrained. No one was pushed. It unfolded like a process already set in motion. I had submitted documentation weeks earlier when the financial irregularities first surfaced. They weren't here because of emotion. They were here because of records. Catherine looked at me. The anger was gone. Only emptiness remained. "You called them?" she asked. "I reported what I was obligated to report," I answered. "Nothing more, nothing less." They asked Catherine to cooperate in clarifying several transactions and related documents. She didn't resist. She nodded, as if she finally understood that the moment had moved beyond negotiation. Her mother and brother left quietly. No one spoke. When the door closed behind them, the estate felt strangely hollow. Diane rose slowly. No trembling shoulders now. No distant stare. She walked to the window and looked out at the rain easing over the garden. Then she turned back to me. "That's enough," she said. 3 words. Clear, steady. Attorney Vance studied her for a moment, then offered a small professional smile. "Mrs. Diane," he said, "I don't believe any further competency evaluations will be necessary." She didn't respond. She simply nodded. I stepped beside my wife. Not to shield her, just to stand where I've stood for 45 years. "I have no desire to keep this house," I told the attorney. The room still carried echoes of what had unfolded, but inside me there was no storm. "Once proceedings are complete," I continued, "please arrange for the sale of the property. After financial obligations are settled, the remaining funds will be added to David's Scholarship Foundation." He made a note. Diane looked at me, her expression softer now than it had been all afternoon. "David would like that," she said. "I believe he would." When we left the estate, the rain had stopped. The sky was still gray, but lighter. I didn't feel like I had defeated anyone. I didn't think of Catherine as an enemy. I thought only of choices, and how each of us lives with the ones we make. Money can create the illusion of power, but it cannot buy trust. It cannot buy memory. It cannot buy a place in a family once you've broken it yourself. Justice is not loud. It doesn't need applause. It only needs time and clear records. That evening, Diane and I returned to our small wooden house. The old car was still parked by the porch. Everything looked the same. Only one thing had changed. We were no longer waiting. If someone asks me what the lesson is, I would say this: you can build a house with money, but you can only build a family with honesty. And no matter how long justice takes, it always knows exactly where to go. If this story made you reflect, or reminded you that truth has a way of standing up on its own, press like and subscribe so I know you're still listening. You can share it with someone who needs a little faith in fairness. Thank you for staying with me until the very last minute. I appreciate it more than you know.